have figured out how to talk about effectively. And the reason for that is because information in our world is now essentially how our world functions through information. We saw that in the most simple way during the pandemic when microchips weren't available and suddenly all sorts of products weren't available. We don't realize the extent to which information drives our entire economy, it drives our political conversation, it drives our lives. And unfortunately, in the United States, it's taken us a while to realize how dangerous information can be and how effective the Russians, frankly, and the Chinese to an extent, and other actors that are our adversaries have figured out how to manipulate information, to use information, and to make it part of their foreign policy in a dangerous way. So let me give you a couple of examples of why this is so complicated. I'm a little older than most of you, in fact, I'm a lot older than most of you. Thank you. Gracias. When I grew up and when I was roughly your age, we thought there was going to be a media revolution that allowed the world to be operating on the same wavelength. And so, for example, when there was a protest, a very important protest in Tiananmen Square in China, we watched that live on television. We watched it on CNN, on the BBC, on all sorts of TV channels. We saw the protests, we saw them building a Statue of Liberty, we saw a young man stand in front of a tank bravely, and then we saw the slaughter that happened. Similarly, when there was a coup attempt in Russia, we watched it on television. We watched Boris Yeltsin stand up to the extremists from the old Soviet government try to take over their government. And there was a revolution, and we watched it live on television in Russia, in Moscow. What's changed is that will never happen again. We will never, ever, as long as communist governments are ruling the PRC, as long as the kind of government they have now in Russia continues, we will not see in a real time, in the way we saw when we were growing up, these events take place. And I show you as an example, last summer there was an attempt to sort of overthrow the Russian government. It was a rather lame attempt, but it was an attempt nonetheless by Prigozhin, one of the generals in the war. And we didn't watch it, we didn't see it, we didn't know about it. The way we found out about it, the way people saw it, was by having journalists read telegram channels and see on a telegram channel what was happening, and then stand up in front of CNN, BBC, Telemundo, whatever they were reporting for, and tell us what they were reading on a telegram channel. Now that was a long riff, and I wanted to put it in one piece because I want you to understand that's how different the world is today. Why am I telling you that story? I'm telling you that story because there is a divide in the world today. There's a divide between governments like Argentina, like the United States, like most of Latin America, a lot of Africa, all of Europe, and Russia and China. They have a different view of information. For Russia and China, information is power, and they use their information to affect their own policies. And so this idea that there was going to be one world, and we were all going to watch that one world together, which some people still hope for, and I would love to see it return, is not going to return so long as we have the authoritarian governments in Beijing and Moscow. And that affects what Beijing and Moscow can do in the rest of the world. Their world is blocked off. There's a Chinese wall. People inside China can't do what you're doing every day. They can't see what you're seeing every day. If they're caught doing so, they can be put in jail. And worse than that, if they turn their phone off, the police come and knock on the door and say, "Why did you turn your phone off?" So we've all in school read the book 1984 about George Orwell, about a society where there are screens. It's not a big screen now, it's a little screen. And in China, and increasingly in Russia, that is the mechanism of control. And so I told that long story so that you could appreciate that there's two worlds. There's the world inside Russia and China, and then there's the world that the rest of us live in. So I don't worry about going on a little long, but I want to explain all that to you because we're going to talk about artificial intelligence in a minute, and I'm happy to take your questions about that. But I wanted to explain to you why the information war that we're living in. You know, in the military, they have something called the domain. They say there's air, there's space, there's land, there's sea. There's now the information domain, which is an element of warfare. And for Russia and China, for a communist party in China, and Russia, which has used information going back centuries, the information domain is part of their idea of the gray zone of war. And we in the United States, you in Argentina, most of Latin America, most of Europeans, we don't think of information in that way. And the reason I told those long accounts is because we have to appreciate that they do. They get up every morning, they have thousands and thousands of rooms like this filled with people who are operating an information war against the United States, against the West, against Europe, against all of the governments that don't agree with them. And I think we can certainly agree that the current government in Argentina is no friend of the Russians. So they are doing this. They see this as part and parcel of their foreign policy. And I told you all that so that you can appreciate why it's so important. So let me just make one more comment, and then I'd really love to hear you pose some questions or hear your point of view on this. One of the programs that we're most proud of, where I work at the State Department, are directly related to Latin America. We, through our own, and you can imagine the intelligence capabilities the United States has, we do a lot of work in this area, and we received some new information that the Russians were starting a disinformation operation in Latin America. And they were planning to set up a base in, I believe it was Chile, and they were going to hire dozens and dozens of people to take ideas about colonialism, about Ukraine, about American being dangerous, and they were going to make it seem like these were Latin American journalists writing about Latin America, but they were all made and stamped by the Kremlin. And we were able to expose that. And we were able to talk about it last fall, and we know that we disrupted it. And so it may not seem important to the generals sitting in certain war rooms or to politicians sitting in their offices, but that's the information war in its real sense. That's what we were able to accomplish in disrupting that operation. That's why I'm so thrilled that there are people like you who understand this problem, and I'm happy to take your questions and for as long as we need to. So thank you.
Yo puedo hablar fuerte porque necesito micrófono. James quiere que le hagamos algunas preguntas, así que vamos a elegir acá algunas personas. Yo tengo muchas preguntas, pero prefiero abrirles el juego a ustedes, así que si alguno tiene una pregunta, alguien quiere hacer alguna, si no puedo empezar yo. Aquí tenemos una pregunta. No hace falta.
Bueno, voy a hablar en español porque para mí es más fácil, aunque lo he entendido bastante. En primer lugar, le agradezco. Le quito el privilegio de ser de los más viejos, porque yo seguramente soy más viejo que usted. Así que, bueno, muchas gracias por toda la información. La pregunta tiene que ver con el hecho que el desarrollo de las redes ha creado un espacio supranacional con reglas y características diferenciadas a la lógica que ha tenido siempre la discusión y la pelea entre estados nacionales. En ese ámbito, el control de la información, como usted lo expresó, es muy importante. Y mi pregunta es, ¿Cómo visualiza, por ejemplo, el rol del señor Musk imponiendo control sobre los usuarios y el de los empresarios como X o Facebook en ese espacio supranacional? ¿Y cómo ve el rol de esas entidades como Google, como Facebook, que de alguna manera se maneja con reglas que son diferenciadas de las que conocemos desde toda la vida en la lucha, digamos, de poder tecnológico entre naciones? Muchas gracias.
Thank you. That was a very good question. Obviously, the age has brought you a lot of wisdom because you've cut to the heart of the problem.
Muchas gracias por una muy buena pregunta. Definitivamente la edad trae aparejada sabiduría. Usted se centró en el meollo del problema.
So when those companies, when the internet began and when the information revolution grew, in the early years, people in the United States and people in the West and Europe, here in South America and Latin America, believed that this was an inherently good thing because it gave individuals and people the opportunity to express their opinion. It gave protest groups an opportunity to organize. It gave the Arab Spring its opportunity to have what seemed to be democratic change. All of these capabilities existed before, but it was slower, it was harder. The fax machine is a lot slower than the social media. And in those days when you and I were young men and we got up in the morning, we listened to one or two TV stations, one or two newspapers, and generally speaking, those newspapers and television stations and radio stations told you the facts. And then you could make up your own mind as to what the right policy was. But you knew what the facts were because there really is only one set of facts. There's not two sets of facts. And in those days, the leaders of those organizations were responsible for being sure that they were factual, more or less. And now, as you have said, and as your question implies, there's nobody responsible for making sure that the information we're reading and seeing on social media, on some of the many different tools of information revolution, there's nobody responsible for being sure they're factual. And in a way that I have to lament as an American, although we were largely responsible for creating many of these technologies, for creating many of these capabilities, again, for the right reasons, because we thought they were a way to spread the truth and spread democracy. We don't have any regulation of this system now. There's no regulation in the United States. Some countries, particularly European countries, have started to do regulation, and they have an ability to impose certain rules on these mega corporations that are promulgating the information. Normally, when an American diplomat, a high-level diplomat like myself, comes to a country like Argentina, I will tell you wonderful things about American corporations and why this is good and why that's good. I'm not going to do that about these corporations. And when I go to Europe, and I spend a lot of time in Europe working with my European colleagues who work on this same subject, I'm trying to help them figure out how legally, through their laws, through their regulation, we can help to put some filters on the pollution that is coming through these systems. But one last thing, because I think it's very important that I emphasize this. As an American official and working on information security, information integrity, trying to fight disinformation, I do not believe governments should be in the business of deciding what is true and what is not true. I don't want my government doing it. I don't want any government doing it. I have a background in journalism. That's not for us to decide as governments what's true and what's not true. But what I think we should be doing, and what I hope you all are working with your government on, and what I want all of those in civil society and academia and journalism who care about this information age we're living in that's so dangerous, we should know the provenance of information. So let me give you a very concrete example. If you're in Eastern Europe and you, let's say, are in the country of Bulgaria, a small country in Eastern Europe, and you read on your screen, the United States has biological weapons in Ukraine. You might believe it, you might think it's true. What you should be reading is Russia says the United States has biological weapons in Ukraine. And you might have a different idea because you know it's the Russian government that is telling you this information. That's what we call provenance. The provenance of information is, to the best of my knowledge, the one thing we should all be able to agree on, that Russia, China, Iran, or even the United States should not be able to secretly, covertly put information into the information system in your country or any country. And if we can find a way to ensure that it is required that the provenance of information is available, then we can rely upon people who are smart, who do their homework, who have been well educated, to understand there's a big difference between Russia saying the United States is doing something horrible or just reading that the United States is doing something horrible. That difference is everything in the business that I work in.
Bueno, nos estamos pasando un poquito, pero creo que vale la pena. Quiero abrir a una última pregunta, James. Me gustaría pedirle a alguien que pregunte sobre inteligencia artificial generativa. Así que ya les dije que quiero que pregunten. Alguien que pregunte. Ay, por favor.
Bueno, de todo gracias. De todo gracias, señor Rubin, por su participación, es importantísimo. En línea con el potencial que la inteligencia artificial generativa puede llegar a tener como herramienta para luchar en esta guerra, le pregunto lo siguiente, que excede a la inteligencia artificial, pero que también tiene que ver. ¿En qué medida piensa usted que la existencia de programas estatales de desinformación, como los impulsados por Rusia y China, por ejemplo, tienen el potencial de desestabilizar la democracia como sistema de gobierno a nivel global? Es decir, ¿tiene la democracia como sistema de gobierno la fortaleza y los recursos necesarios para sostenerse frente a esta amenaza? Gracias.
Wow, that was another good question. You don't have to be an elderly gentleman to ask a good question.
Otra muy buena pregunta. No hace falta tener edad más avanzada para poder hacer una autocrítica.
Más o menos.
I wake up every morning worried about this question. That's what I do for a living. Worried about whether democratic societies will have the strength to realize that authoritarian governments are uniting together in a kind of a group to try to put forward ideas and policies and wars that will harm the democratic world. And I will answer the generative AI question, but I first want to explain a little bit about this group that's so important. I've been working in the foreign policy business for something like 35 years, and I've never seen a clearer case of aggression, warfare, than Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's the clearest thing there can be. Hundreds of thousands of troops, one morning, for no reason, invaded their neighbor to swallow it up and to defeat it. Hundreds of thousands of troops. Not a little war, a World War I, World War II style war with tanks, airplanes, missiles, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers with no justification, no arguments. There is no justification for this behavior. This is the kind of thing that happened that we read about in history books, about World War II and World War I. And when Russia and China are able to confuse people enough for them to wonder, well, I'm not sure, Ukraine, Russia, which side to be on, that tells me the world is at risk. Right now, China is providing the defense industrial capability for Russia to fight this war. The ingredients, the microelectronics, the imagery, the optical capabilities, the engines for drones, all of the military industrial complex that is allowing Russia to fight the war is done, not all of it, but most of it in China. And North Korea is providing the tens of thousands of workers to build ammunition, artillery shells, hundreds of thousands of artillery shells. And Iran is providing artillery and other equipment. So you have this group of countries. Think about the four that I'm talking about. North Korea, Iran, China, and Russia are all enabling Russia's military machine in a war that is completely unjustified. So when you hear the United States government or friends of the United States talking about Ukraine, it's not just because it's a European country or it's in the north or because we have friendships with NATO countries. It's because of the magnitude of the war and the significance of allowing a war like this to happen without a response from the rest of the world. It's got nothing to do with our regional, we don't care about Latin America, so we're worried about Ukraine. Ukraine is so important for the reasons that I just said. Generative AI is another technology that has capabilities that are very positive, and it has capabilities that are very negative. And at least this time, I think the companies involved, the initiators involved, the leaders involved have realized that they don't want to do what those other companies did that we talked about earlier. And they've come to the US government and said, you know, this technology is complicated, potentially dangerous. Let's figure out a way to make it less dangerous. So you asked me, will the democracies have the strength to respond to this threat of generative AI? And my answer is we need to have the strength to respond to the countries that would use generative AI in a dangerous way. If we can't respond to the war in Ukraine, we're never going to be able to respond to the information about the war in Ukraine. We're never going to respond to the use by the PRC and by Russia of generative AI. Think of how easy it will be when they get good at it to take one of these phony stories, these disinformations that they use for Ukraine, and to instantly translate it into 150 languages so that the whole world reads it in ways that are tailored to that country or that region or that particular social group. That's the danger of generative AI. So I'm going to end now by trying to be a little bit more optimistic.
Voy a terminar ahora con un comentario un poco más optimista.
We have realized that information warfare is real, is being pursued by the same governments that are pursuing the war in Ukraine and others. And we are now, I think, just beginning to formulate an effective response. And just the way it took some years after 9/11 for the world to figure out how to fight terrorism effectively, not so much by invading other countries, but by working domestically on no-fly lists, on interviews with extremists, on the criminal aspects of terrorism. It took us a while to get good at that. It's going to take us a while to get good at fighting this. But the goal is, and we've developed a framework for fighting disinformation. We are building a coalition to fight disinformation. In the same way we built a coalition to fight ISIS, to fight Al-Qaeda, etc. It's going to take time, but we have to get all the relevant countries to realize the danger, to agree on the best way to fight it, and then to start operating in a uniform way, because you have to make sure that people don't misuse the word disinformation. Disinformation is not a story in the newspaper you don't like. Disinformation that I'm working on is something that was made in the Kremlin, that was made by the PRC with the specific purpose of dividing democratic countries and changing their policies. And that's the coalition that we need to build, a coalition that will fight that effort on those terms and not get into the business of deciding what's true or not true, and most definitely not get into the business of interfering with the work of journalism. And I think that's enough for one morning, yes?
Una mañana al caso.
Un aplauso, por favor.